The Colchester Sexual Assault Centre is thrilled to welcome our next special guest speaker. In today's session, we will be exploring the First Nations perspective, and joining us is a BIPOC support services educator, and her name is Calendula Sack. She is a two-spirit trans woman from Indian Brook, and she is currently living and thriving in Halifax on the unceded and unsurrendered lands of the Mi'kmaq. Calendula works as a BIPOC support services educator at the Halifax branch of the Youth Project, and she is the recipient of the Candy Palmer Award in 2022. So I will now hand it off to her, and she can tell you a little bit more about herself and jump right into the presentation. So welcome again, and we're looking forward to your presentation today.
Hi, folks. Thank you so much for the introduction. My name is Calendula Sack. I use she, her pronouns. I am a two-spirit trans woman, and I am Ilnu Anehia, so I am Mi'kmaq and Plains Cree. Yeah, my family have been living here for centuries and generations, and my sister actually helped me with some of the pieces for this workshop. Her name is Ariel Twist. You might know her. She is an author and poet and artist. So in this workshop, we are doing impacts of trauma and sexual violence on marginalized groups for the First Nations perspective. So topics for today. We are going to be starting with introducing colonization. Then we're going to do othering and dehumanization, defining two-spirit, consent and power, missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit people, residential schools, and intergenerational trauma, and then lastly, healing. So there might be a lot of points in the beginning of the workshop where you're like, Calendula, I don't get it. Why are you talking about all this history and like all of this other stuff and all these other points? Doesn't sound like you're getting to the sexual violence yet. And we're not going to get there, but in the workshop, we are definitely going to get to the point. But in my work as somebody who practices decolonial ways of healing, I feel like it's important to me to set up some groundwork before we move on into the meat of the topic, and to like have a good conversation about decolonization and colonization and history is really important for like understanding the pieces later. At least it is to me. But without further ado, let's get started. Section 1, Intro to Colonization. So what is colonization? It is the action or process of settling among and establishing control over the Indigenous peoples of an area. It is also the action of appropriating a place or domain for one's own use. And you might be wondering, what's an Indigenous person? Well, Indigenous people are kind of folks who have lived on certain territories of land for time immemorial, and for as long as they can remember. And also these folks tend to know the most about the land as well. People aren't just Indigenous to Canada or Turtle Island. There are also Indigenous people in Australia and New Zealand, for example. There's a picture on the right of me. Some of you folks might have seen this picture before, some of you might have not. It's totally fine. Another thing I like to do in my practice and my coworkers like to do is a visual description, meaning that we're going to do a description of the painting you see here today. So bear with me for a little bit. It's also a really good practice of sort of breaking down what is happening in this painting. So what this painting is called is American Progress, but it's also called Manifest Destiny. So you might have heard both names. It was painted by John Gast in 1872. And the woman in the middle, her name is Columbia. So Columbia, the female figure of America, leads Americans into the West and into the future. So what you have here is a landscape painting. So it's sort of setting the scene. It's sort of a big picturesque sort of visage. You have a mountain in the background and wide open fields. And in the far right corner, you can see what looks like a harbor or what looks like a river or what have you. In the middle of the painting, you have a giant white woman. This giant white woman, of course, is Columbia. And she is sort of this giant floating figure with white Roman garbs and sort of flowing, wavy golden hair. Um, so on the far left of the painting, you can see huntsmen or hunters, I should say, sort of looks like they're fleeing. So you have indigenous hunters on horses and you have buffalo in the background, sort of fleeing further into the west. And they're sort of chasing these clouds, or these dark clouds are hovering over them. And this holy figure, this woman, is sort of leading bright skies into the lands, and the indigenous people are taking the dark skies with them. So they're being chased out. On the bottom right, you can see some agriculture being built, like you can see some farmlands. It looks like they're ready to start planting. You can see some train tracks and railroads even being constructed as you're moving more to the right. And boats are coming into the harbor. When I was younger, I always thought this woman was holding a Bible, but actually people assume that she's holding a school book. Um, and it's very interesting because for Indigenous people, we practice mainly oral tradition, meaning that our stories and our practices and our ways of being were taught from elders down to the young people, the children. That's because they're going to be leading the community in the future, and the elders have been here the longest and they have the most to teach, whereas the young healthy adult human can go and do the hunting and take care of the lands and everything. I always thought this was really interesting that she was holding a school book because there exists these tenets of white supremacy, and one of the tenets of white supremacy is worship over the written word. So if it's written down and if it's documented, then it must be, or it must be true, or it must be considered. But since Indigenous people didn't actually have any documents like this, they were kind of more disregarded, and their ways of being were disregarded much easier. So the woman you saw in the painting is the exact same woman that you see in the Columbia picture sort of opening, which always surprised me. When I found out, I was quite shocked. Another sort of description, you have the same white woman in Roman garbs from the last painting, and she is draped once again in these flowing white garbs with a blue sash, and she's holding a torch up high, standing in front of some really big clouds. And this is Lady Columbia. Columbia is the female national personification of the United States. It is also a historical name applied to the Americas and to the New World. Columbia is also sort of the mascot for the Republican Party, or she is like a symbol. It's kind of like her thing that she is like good faith and she is quite godly. And so it's really interesting, say, going back to see how you have this holy figure, which is chasing out the indigenous peoples of the area. And what this painting essentially is saying is that this sort of progression is quite good, and that the indigenous people who are fleeing are actually holding them back, are actually the issue at hand. And once you have such sort of characteristics in such a painting, it's really easy to see what the message being told is. It's that colonization was quite good, in the painter's opinion. But you see this painting everywhere, and it's always a little bit hilarious from an Indigenous perspective. So, settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is a distinct type of colonialism that functions through the replacement of indigenous populations with an invasive settler society that, over time, develops a distinctive identity and sovereignty. And sovereignty means supreme power or authority, or the ability for self-governance. So if you are able to be an autonomous body, then you have sovereignty, and like especially in like a government kind of setting. So you might have seen that Indigenous people have been fighting for sovereignty for quite some time. And if you didn't know what that meant, this is kind of the vibe that we're fighting for our land back, and we're also fighting for our tribunal ways of being able to be recognized, especially in like a legal setting or institutional setting even. Um, it's really important to name that Canada, North America is a settler colonial society. It's not the only settler colonial society. There's also Australia and once again, New Zealand. Their own histories are quite interesting, and I highly recommend doing some Googling if you have the free time. But the sort of Indigenous perspective on these histories is really quite interesting. So a little bit of colonization, talking about how sort of the visage or sort of the idea around colonization is that it was for the better. It was a worthy cause, and regardless of the violence that happened or took place, everything turned out correct and right in the end. I oftentimes see people who are not into the idea of decolonization mention that because of colonialism and because of the advancements of the European or the Christian body, that if we had left things to the Indigenous perspective and ways of being, that we wouldn't have come as far in society as we are now. Kind of going into some more social justice-y and like sociology terms and vibes. I'm gonna read everything that's on the slides in front of me, so bear with me. So, othering takes place when individuals or groups are defined and labeled as not fitting in with the standards or norms of a social group. Othering also includes attributing negative, harmful, dangerous characteristics and stereotypes to individuals or groups who do not belong to the normative group. Othering is also the collective process of dehumanizing and vilifying people who are different from you. Dehumanization. Dehumanization is a process in which a group or individual views another group or individual as being less than human. Additionally, refusing to see someone's humanity or their complexity is also dehumanizing. An example, calling someone an animal or an illegal alien is a dehumanizing act to do. And absolutely, please refrain from doing it, but continuing forward. By dehumanizing other people or social groups, it allows you to treat them without any moral considerations or ethics. And this is kind of the base of everything I want to talk about here today. If you are referring to somebody being less than human, or if you're referring to them as a creature or something that is not worthy of society, it kind of gives you're giving yourself permission to treat somebody else without any moral considerations. And that's something to keep in mind. So kind of continuing on with colonization themes, savage. So savage is a word that was very commonly and popularly used against Indigenous people on Turtle Island to justify their treatment, to justify their murder, the rape, the assault, the disintegrating of the community unit and the family unit, everything. This word gave colonizers the justification to do bad things. And it wasn't just used against Indigenous people in Canada, it was also used popularly in the Caribbean as well. Savage. Someone or something that is savage is extremely cruel, violent, and uncontrolled. The term savage is deeply rooted in settler colonialism used primarily to justify colonization by dehumanizing Indigenous peoples, in particular with regard to North American Indigenous peoples.